Hi, welcome to the video on digital input and digital output for the Arduino. In the last video, we went through the basics of variables and how we use them in the Arduino development environment. In this video, we're going to actually start doing things with them. And if you remember, we also talked a little bit about the circuit that we're using for this example, and it's just a simple LED with a resistor. And then you have a pin on the Arduino that's sending power to the circuit, and then you're connecting the circuit back to ground on the Arduino board. So if you're a little bit confused about what's going on, check out the picture that's showing the circuit that we're controlling here, because that's what we're going to be writing the code here to control. So okay, so let's talk a little bit about digital input and digital output. Okay, so let's first go back to the Arduino website here, and let's take a look at what Arduino tells us for the digital I/O, digital input output. Okay, so there's a couple of things that Arduino has for us on digital input and output. First off is pin mode, and what this means is it's telling us that we have to tell the Arduino board what's the function of the pin, and we can change this. You know, we can use pin 10 as an input on one project and then use it as an output on another project. So the main thing to know here is that there's two major modes, input or output. And you'll see where we use that in a second, or why we use that in a second. Okay, so now let's get into some of the commands here. We have a digital write command, and we can either write to high or low. And really what this means is on or off. If you have a 5-volt board, what that means is if you set to high or on, you're supplying 5 volts from that pin. If you write it to low or off, you're supplying 0 volts, no volts to that pin. So this is just a quick way that allows us to supply voltage to circuits, either supply or turn off voltage to circuits. There's also a digital read function, and what this does when you use it with a pin that's set up as an input, it will tell you the value of the circuit depending on where you're taking measurements from. It'll tell you if it's either high or low. So that can be useful if you want to use or just monitor the state of a circuit and tell you whether it's on or off. So those are the three major functions there. So let's get into how we go about using those in a real world example here. Okay, so first I'm going to start in the void setup region here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the pin mode command. And how we do that is you just use the same exact syntax that it showed you on the website. So if we come here to pin mode, it'll tell you an example here, syntax. This is the command, pin mode, and then you need to tell it the pin, which pin, and then which mode in terms of input or output. So we can just go ahead and use that right into our code. So pin mode, notice that it's turned orange because we're using a command now. So just does that so that it's easy for you to see and also verify that you're using the right command, because it should turn orange. So in this case, we're not going to use a specific pin. You could just put in the number 10 for pin 10 here. But since we're using variables, we're going to be a little bit fancy here. We're going to say light pin, and then comma, space, and then we're going to set it to output. And then again, notice that it turned blue, and notice that I had to use all capitals for that. If I were to say that, it doesn't recognize that as a command or as a setting. So you have to write it in capitals. Okay, so with that string of code there, we've just set our pin 10 as an output. Another thing here, whenever you've ended a line of code, it needs to end with a semicolon. That's just a syntax thing. I'm not really going to get into it, but just make sure you do that. If you don't, it'll throw an error and tell you that you need to put a semicolon, or that it expects a semicolon, something like that. So one quick thing on the variables again. As I said, we could have used just pin 10 in here, but we've used the variable. And really, this is a good example of why variables are useful, because we could reuse light pin, and we will actually in this program, in several different spots. And it's easier to remember the word light pin instead of, gosh, what pin was I using as the voltage again? I'm not really sure. Was it 10? Was it 9? Was it 8? And the longer your program gets, the more confusing, or the harder it is to remember these things. So that's really why we use variables again. This is just a good example of it. It's much easier to remember light pin. If I want to use it in several spots, it's just light pin. So just another good example on how we do that. Okay, so now we're going to come down here to the void loop. And again, the void setup is just something that runs once. So this is a perfect place to put our pin mode code, because it's just going to run once, and after that we don't need it to run again. So we're going to come down here to the void loop, and this is where we're going to actually use the digital commands for digital input, digital output. Okay, so digital write. Let's go to the syntax, and this is what it's telling us. Digital write is the command, and then we need to supply a pin and a value, either high or low, again for on or off. So we're going to use that same syntax here, and this is what it's going to look like. So digital write, and again, notice here we're capitalizing the second word. That's just a syntax thing, and it's turned orange, so we know we're heading in the right direction. So now I'm going to use our variable again, and again here we could have put 10, but I'm going to use the variable, and now I'm telling it to write high, or turn it on. And that's all we really need to do for this. So after we verify it and upload it to the board, it's going to ask us to save first. But after you do all that, if you set up the circuit or one similar to the one that I'm using, it will turn your light on. So, and it will keep it on. So that's really the basics of digital write. Again, we could also use a digital read here, but it doesn't really make sense for us to do that because we're just controlling a simple LED. If you had a more sophisticated circuit where you needed to do that, then it's pretty simple. Just reference the website, the Arduino website, for that information. But that's all we're going to really get into here on the digital input and digital output. So in the next video, we're going to talk about analog input and analog output.